So last time, first of all, welcome to the share. I think this is lecture number 18. And we are in Chelek Aleph, that's part 1, chapter 20. In the Pines, that would get you to page 46 in the volume 1 of the Pines. So the today I'm going to continue reading. I hope to cover 2 chapters, Parak 20 and Parak 21, and we're going to continue the the Rambam's analysis of different words and terms. As we're going to find, as the Rambam progresses through these terms and translating the terms, he little by little starts getting more and more away from the terms and into philosophical ideas. We're going to get a little bit of a feel for that today, and I'm going to go off on a few tangents today, and I hope you'll like them. So in chapter 20, the first word is the word ram, right? Ram, resh mem in Hebrew, which is also meaning, as Rambam says, I'm reading from the Pines, high is an equivocal term having the signification of being elevated in space and of being elevated in degree. So something that is ram, it is high, meaning it is high, literally it's high up in space, as in the up-down dimension. And it also means high in status, right? In degree. So an exalted station, nobility, or great worth. You say a person is high, a nobleman is a person is in a high position, a high social position. It doesn't mean he's at a higher altitude or than you or I, or it just means that he's higher in society or higher in his status. So therefore it says, and the ark was lifted high above the earth. With that, in that passage, the first sense of the term employed, in other words, the ark, the teva that Noah was in, the ark that Noah was in, was higher. Literally, it was lifted up, right? But it also says, I have placed on high one chosen out of the people, right? That pasuk would be in Hebrew, Harimosi bachor me'am, right? In Tehillim, or Yan asher harimoticha min offer, I raised you up from the dirt. It's not speaking about a elevation. It's speaking about I raised your status up from the dirt. Yan asher harimoticha mitocham, I raised you up from among the nation, right? So these are all, so they're mina eni nasheni. I'm flipping back to the kapach a little bit in Hebrew. That's the second meaning of the word ram. And anytime it uses the word ram in reference to God, it doesn't mean height in space, that God is physically higher than us, but rather it means that God's status is loftier, is greater than us. V'chein nasa, and the same thing is the Hebrew term nasa, or naso, which would mean to carry or to raise, right? And Pine says that the term to bear has similarly the signification of elevation in space. It also means you raise something up in space, but it also means to elevate in degree, and it also means to elevate by abundance of good fortune, when a person has a lot of good. And Rambam is going to give us some examples of that. So for example, many times raising in space, it means that he doesn't need to bring examples, but when it means raising something in status, vatinasei malchuso, his kingdom shall be borne aloft or elevated. Vayinat leim vayinas aim, he took them and he raised them. Umadua tisnasu, when Korach came to Moshe and said, Madua tisnasu, wait, why do you raise yourselves above the nation? Whenever the word Nasiya is referring to God, it's referring to it in its latter meaning. Hanasi Shofei Ta'aretz, the judge of the land, is Nasa, is raised up. Koamar Ram Vanisa, so says the elevated and lofty one, and so on and so forth. And if it means Romimut, his greatness, Ugedula, and his a station, exalted station, and oaths and his great strength or great worth, is the way the Pine says. And if you're going to think that this is like, how could one word mean so many things, right? How can it should be clear, he says, and now I'm reading back in English, however, it shall be made clear to you that in the opinion of those who have perfect apprehension, people that, if you're an intelligent person, understands that there should not be many attributive qualifications predicated of God, that in general, right, all of these descriptions of God, there's really none of them are truly describing God. All of the time, when we attribute on all of the numerous attributive qualifications, including any exaltation of him and his great worth, power, perfection, bounty, and various other things, ultimately, they're all referring to the one thing. They're just saying that God is God, and he's so much greater and higher and all of these things than we are, that we can't even call him actually great or high, and so on. That notion is his essence and nothing outside this essence. And we're going to talk about this later in more detail, how you get to the point of understanding that even as we refer to God as high or elevated or lofty, none of these terms really mean anything in reference to God. So that's chapter 20. So we now know what it means to be high and lofty. Now, before we do 21, I want to go off on a little bit of a tangent. So I'll give people about 30 seconds to a minute to get a chumash, a Torah, a Bible, whatever you want to call it, a Sefer Shmos, and open it up to chapter 33. I'll wait a second if you want. I'm going to read through it, but if you have a second, go get one. Okay, now I want everyone to, we're going to start reading from chapter 33, verse 12, and I'll give you a little context first. Now, a little secret, all of these terms that Rambam has been translating for us, these last 17 lectures that we've been studying together, many of the words, almost all of them, come straight out of the chapters the chapter and a half or so that I'm about to read to you. And we'll understand why, because this chapter is one of the most, it's extremely powerful on so many levels, and also so difficult to really understand. And what Rambam is going to try to help us understand, but it's going to take us many more lectures to get through the entire Chelek Aleph, is give us the tools with which we can look at a parsha in the Torah, which we're about to read together, and understand it in a Maimonidean way, right? And not in a simple way. So you'll see all of these terms, pretty much if you go back to the beginning of the terms that we discussed yeshiva, kima, sitting, standing, amidah. We discussed the term yatzav, right, to stand erect, to stand straight. We discussed the term tzur, a rock. We discussed the term coming close, a throne, and so on and so forth. All these terms, many of these terms came straight out of the chapters we're about to read. And then after we read through this, I want to go to, I'm going to read a little bit of Chazal on it, of some Gemara from the Talmud, from Masechet Rosh Hashanah. And then we're going to learn how Rambam translates the term avar, to pass, right? Or to pass by, or to pass over. So just a little bit of context. What had just happened in the Torah right before chapter 33 was the Chet HaEgel, the sin of the golden calf. God was very angry with the people. Moshe had just broken the luchot. He had just smashed the tablets, and God says to Moshe in a very scary statement. If we look back, a very frightening statement, which actually go back to chapter 33, verse 5, right? Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, God said to Moshe, Emor el bnei Yisrael, say to the people of Israel, Atem am ksheor, if you are a stubborn nation, thick-necked nation, Rega echad, in one moment, I could come, if I were to be among you, I will just wipe you out. Vi'ata, now, hored ed yichame elecha, take the special garbers that you have upon you, and I will decide what I'm going to do with you. So the sense here is a sense that God is giving up on his people. He's going that way. The people go, you can go wherever you want, but I'm not with you anymore. That's the sense. That's the feeling that we get. But that's not exactly what happens. And we're going to read in starting verse 12. So Moshe goes to speak to God, or to be with God. The people go back, and now what's going to be? God says, I'm going to decide. So let's read about this process. So Vayomer Moshe el Hashem. Moshe says to God, Re'eh, see, and look out while we read this. Think about words and terms that you and I have already come across in the Rama. Okay, Re'eh and see, Ata, and a lot of these issues that are going to pop up here are very important, and we're not going to answer them all today, but just let's think about it as we read it. Ata Omer Eli, you said to me, this is Moshe speaking to God, Ha'al et ha'am hazeh, bring up this nation. V'ata lo haldatani et asher tishlach imi, and you have not told me what you are going to send, or who you are going to send with me. Now, remember, God had said in verse 2 of this chapter, I'm going to send before, I'm going to keep my promise. I'm going to send you to the land of Israel, but I'm sending, instead of me, I'm sending an agent, something, a go-between, some kind of agent. Now, this is very frightening to Moshe, because the basic foundation of monotheism, of the idea that's being introduced to the world, and that was just introduced to the world at Har Sinai, was that there are no agents, there are no intermediaries, right? There is nothing between humanity, and most specifically the people of Israel, and God. We talk directly to him, he leads us directly. So if God says, I'm going to send an agent, Moshe is now asking God, you didn't tell me, what do you mean you're going to, what does this mean? Lo hodatani et asher tishlachimi. We usually translate that, whom you are sending with me. But eight is not a word that means anything. Eight means some kind of entity is going to be between us and you. This creates a tremendous challenge in Moshe's mind. Like, what do you mean? Is there such a thing as something between humanity and God? That is the very definition of idolatry. So, Vi'ata Amarta, and you said, Yidaticha b'shem, I know you, Moshe, by name. So, V'gam matzati chen be'enai, I found favor in your eyes. So, in other words, you like me. I'm okay. I'm cool. You said I'm okay. So explain to me exactly what you meant, right? V'ata, and now, imna matzati chen be'enecha, if it is true that I have found favor in your eyes, hodi'eni na et rochecha, tell me, please, your way. V'edoacha, so that I will know you. So that I will know how to find favor in your eyes. And also see, this nation that you have chosen, this is your nation. This is not a nation with some intermediary, with some idol to worship. That was the mistake of the golden calf itself, right? So Vayomar, and God said, Panai, and this is important because panim is one of the words Rambam will translate for us, not today necessarily, but Panai Yelechu, actually he will touch on it today. Panai Yelechu v'anichoti lach. I myself, Panai, my face, it will be me, Panai, and why he uses the term face we're going to get to, will go before you, v'hanichoti lach, and I will be the one who makes the road easy for you. And when I said I will send the messenger, I didn't mean there's an intermediary. No, it's me, myself, God says. That's his answer to Moshe. This is how we know from God's answer what Moshe's question was. Moshe's question was, what do you mean there's an intermediary, right? That disrupts everything I ever knew about this whole idea of who you are as God and what our mission here is. And God says, no, it's me, right? Vayomer Elav, and so then Moshe said to him in response, Im ein panecha holchem, if it wasn't you yourself, your face itself, going in front of us, in other words, if this whole mission that I have been believing and teaching of monotheism, right, of one God and only a God with nothing in between him and his creations, then because if that wasn't true, Moshe says, Al Taleinu, he said, don't bother taking us. Don't tell me about fulfilling promises. You'll take us to the land anyway, but send us with an intermediary. Don't bother with that, because there's no point. If it's not just us and God, but there has to be something in between, I'm not interested. And no one's interested. There's no point. This is what Moshe is saying to God himself. And therefore Moshe asks, so how will I then know? Right? In other words, if there is an intermediary, if we're not speaking directly to God, how would I ever know? How will I ever know that I have found favor in your eyes? The idea of the Aseret HaDibrot, of the 10 Commandments, was the way we know if we're in God's favor is by doing and living God's commandments. But if there's an intermediary, what do? How do we appease that intermediary? How do we pray to that intermediary? That's what idol worship is, right? How will I ever know? You, me, Moshe, and my nation. I'm sorry, and your nation. The only way we will know is if you yourself come with us. And then there is something special, something different about I and your nation than all the other nations that worship idols, that believe in intermediaries, right? From all the other nations that are on land. If we don't have direct contact with God and we have intermediaries, then we're just like everyone else worshiping idols. But let's continue. Vayomer Hashem Moshe, and God said to Moshe, it is this thing also, this which you said, I will do. Because it is true. You have found favor in my eyes. And I know you by name. I know who you are. Vayomar, so Moshe said, now, show me your honor. Show me who you are. Show me your essence, Moses asked God. Tremendous amount of audacity, but this is Moshe speaking here. Vayomer, and God said, Ani avir kol tuvi al panecha. I can pass everything, all of my goodness in front of you. V'karasi, and I will call out b'shem Adonai lefanecha, in the name of God before you. V'chanosi et asher achon v'richamti eshet terachem. And I will have mercy on whoever I decide to, and I will have kindness for whoever I'll have kindness. In other words, my actual ways you won't know. Those decisions are still mine. Vayomer lo tuchal lirot es panayim. God continues to say, you cannot see my face. You cannot see my essence, because a man cannot see me and then live. And this should be familiar to us. There's a place here with me. Rambam already translated this a couple of lectures ago. And you stand here by the rock. When my honor passes, I'll put you in a crack in the rock. Rambam translated that already. Now, this could sound very anthropomorphic. We see this as if it's a conversation between two individuals almost. But Rambam has already been leading us up to how he understands these verses. I will then remove my hand. You'll see behind me. You'll not see my face. So then I'm going to skip verse 1 and 2 of the next chapter. And then it says, and God says in verse 3, you come up alone. I'll skip that. Because he was giving verse 4. And now I'm going to go to verse 5. Now these words should sound familiar to anyone who prayed slichot, the special prayers that we say on before Rosh Hashanah, when we're all doing tshuva, repenting before God. We know these prayers very closely in these verses. Vayered Adonai ba'anan, God came down in the cloud. Vayisyatzei Moshe, and he stood there with Moses. Vayikra b'shem Adonai, and he called out in the name of God. Vaya'avar Adonai al panav, and God passed. Literally, this is how I'm going to translate it now, and then we're going to read Rambam and see how he translated it. God passed by his face, vayikra, and he called out, Adonai, Adonai, God, El Racham Uchanan, the God who is compassionate and merciful. Erech Apayim, he takes a long time to get angry. He has a lot of patience. For Chesed, and he is full of kindness, for Emes, and truth. He gives kindness for the thousands. No say avon. He forgives sin, v'fesha, v'chata, and deliberate sin, and rebelliousness, and so on. So I'm going to stop over here. So there's a lot to unpack here. There's a lot here that leaves us wanting for understanding. What is this going on back and forth? And remember that, when we say, and what does this mean? God passed before him, right? If you understand God as a being, then it makes sense. But how would Maimonides explain this, and how would he translate these terms? Now, before I do this, I want to read an extremely anthropomorphic sounding Chazal. And then you'll see how, when we learn Rambam and how he understands it, we'll see and understand how different Rambam understands it from what we might have thought when we first read it. So those of us that learned Daf Yomi about approximately a year and a quarter ago, we studied the Masechet Rosh Hashanah. And in Masechet Rosh Hashanah on Daf 17, page 17b, it says, Vaya'avor Hashem al ponav vayikra. The Gemara there is discussing this verse of God passed over his face and he called out. And the Gemara is wondering, like, what does this mean, right? God passed in front of Moshe's face. Like, it just doesn't, like, how are we to understand it? And Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, Ilmale Mikra Kasav, had this not been a verse in the Torah, it would have been impossible. It would have been blasphemous to even state that term. In other words, for me to state those words, God passed before Moshe, Rabbi Yochanan is saying, that would have been blasphemy. But the Torah says it, so it's not blasphemy. I'm reading the verse. Milamed, this teaches us, and then he says something really strange. So what does it mean? And he leaves us with more questions than answers. God wrapped himself up as if he was leading the prayers in the synagogue with the talis, right? With the prayers. And he taught Moshe how to pray, right? How we daven. Amarlo, Kolzman Yisrael Chotin. Anytime the people are sunken in sin, right? Which was in this case because the golden calf had just occurred. Yasu lefonai keseder hazeh. Say these words, right? Vani mochelem, and I will forgive them. Remind me of my compassion. So Rabbi Yochanan started off with this question: what is this? This is so anthropomorphic. What does it mean that God passed? And then he starts describing God wrapping himself in a prayer shawl. Like what? What is going on here? So it's for those that want, so I'm going to leave that aside, and we'll allow Rambam to tell us what's going on in Rosh Hashanah, because that's what he's about to explain to us in this piece here. There is how should I say? There is another one other quick tangent that I want to go on before I read this next chapter, and that is that I was learned in yeshiva in Ner Israel in Baltimore, and the Rosh Yeshiva, the who I studied under the most was Rabbi Yaakov Kalevsky. And I studied by him for several years, and he was famous for after we were all kind of like one of the top classes in the yeshiva, and we had all been studying Gemara Talmud for years and years and years. We were at a high level, and when we get to his class, he would always start off by reading the text. And a lot of guys would get upset, like, I read it already. I've come to the class to learn something new, something different. But he was trying to teach us the importance of understanding the actual meaning of the words. When you don't understand something, read it again. Read what the words are teaching you rather than what you are trying to find in them. And until now in Rambam, he's been emphasizing that so much, that read the words carefully and you'll find the wisdom there, right? Read what the Torah is. If you want the answer to your big theological questions, open the book again and read it carefully. And the answers are there. The answers are in the Torah. They're not going to come from your head. They're going to come from what the Torah is teaching you. So now, and Rambam is teaching us to do that, and he's giving us the tools that we need to do it, so that later, when we get to the later parts of the book, we'll have the tools that we need to read the text and see what it really says. And even the Gemara that I just read to you from Rabbi Yochanan about God wrapping himself in a prayer shawl, all of a sudden we can look back at it and we'll have the opportunity to read what it really meant. And here we go. So Avar, in Yano Harishon, right? And I'm reading now in the Pines, you'll find this chapter 21. I may just jump out of the text and just start speaking on my own, but in this case, there are some places where Pine's English is better than Kapach's Hebrew, and some places where it's otherwise. So I'm going to jump back and forth. So the first thing, when it says vai ovar, to pass over, to pass, the first meaning of this term is that of passage in Arabic, is the same term as to pass. It's concerned with when you have a person who's going in a line, he's walking in a direction, and there's something here, and you walk past it, so that's the lavar, that's to pass it. Okay, so that's where it says the words "v'hu avar lifneim" or "avar lifneim," pass in front of the nation. It means to walk in front of them, to pass by them. There's many places in the Torah where avar means to pass in front of someone. However, but then it also became borrowed. The term was also used figuratively, and I'm turning the page now to 48, of sounds in the air. So a sound like passes by us in the air. Often the word "vayaviru kol b'machane," a sound or a voice was passed through the camp. Asher anochi shomea ma'avirim im Hashem, and so on. Other examples where we see that where I hear the Lord's people caused to pass, and so on. Afterwards, then it also meant the light and the presence of God, right, that prophets see. They often will use the term that God's presence passed before them or passed through something. So for example, Ashan v'lapid eish asher avar bein hagzorim ha'ela. We see it by the Brit bein habesarim, by Abraham's vision of the covenant between God and Abraham. Abraham saw the presence of God passing between the two sides, in the path between the two halves of the animal, right? And this was a vision that Abraham was seeing, and a vision of prophecy. Right, because it says "Vitar demon nafla Avram," a deep sleep overcame Avram. So, and similarly, we find, and this little cute reference to Passover, "V'avarti be'eretz Mitzrayim." God says, "And I will pass through the land of Egypt." And Rambam is hinting to us, it doesn't mean that God Himself is walking around Egypt, right? It means that the perception of God's presence was felt in Egypt in every similar way. Okay, and also it also means if somebody is doing something, but he's done a job that's so great beyond what anyone else has done before, or beyond what he has done before, like you pass you break a record. In Hebrew, the term would be used avaret kulo. He passed over his boundaries. He went beyond what he's usually capable of doing. It can also mean, and this is important, and this is going to lead us right into the verse that we were just talking about. If you miss a target, right? So let's say you're aiming at a target and you throw the arrow or the spear at a target and you overshoot. So it passes over the target and it lands on something else. There, it's also used, and he brings the verse from David and Jonathan, but the story where the arrow passed, right, its target, right? It passed it where it was heading. So now it's, according to me, the Rambam says, this is, and I'm using my own words now, this is what it means when it says Vayavor Hashem al panav, that God, I translated it before, and God passed over his before his face. What does this mean? The word panav, right, his face, is not referring to God passing before Moses' face, right? However, it's referring to God's face. Now, what does that mean? And a hint would be what Chazal said in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, that Gemara that I told you, right? That God's face was wrapped in a talit, in a prayer shawl. What Rambam, sorry? I just forgot I got muted. Okay, I didn't have everyone muted. I apologize. So if you do want to say something, then please unmute yourself and speak. So so the idea here is like this. So when the Chachamim referred to Panav, they understood Panav as being God's face. And the question the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah was asking is, how is it that we can discuss God's face? And the answer was that God appeared to Moshe as if he was a teacher or a leader in the synagogue and taught him a lesson, right? That was the answer. That was what, because the Gemara was thinking the word panav is referring to God's face. That was why it was, number one, so astounding, but it also made the answer obvious. Obviously, it's not talking about God's face. So it's talking about, nothing passed by Moshe's face because there was no reference to Moshe's face. The reference was to God's face. And therefore, the answer is that it was how God appeared to Moshe as a teacher. So, and Va'afal Pisha has I'm reading the Kapach now, even though the way it was mentioned, they mentioned it kind of on the aside, with Agadot, with many different stories, Agadot meaning stories from which we learn lessons, but don't necessarily reflect the truth. She'ein zeh mekoma, and it's not my place now to discuss why would God appear as a shliach tzibur with a prayer shawl, right? However, what I'm drawing from this Gemara is that it's clearly, the Gemara understood panav to be referring to God's face. Now, if it refers to God's face, how do we do the rest of them? So let's keep going. And according to me, says the Rambam, the kafisha nearly the way it seems to me is as follows: Moshe was asking God for a certain level of understanding of God. Also that Moshe was asking to see God's face. That's how it was being kina. That was the nickname that the Torah used to describe what Moshe was asking God for. Bi'amro, and then when God answered, ufonai lo yero, when God answers, no, you cannot achieve that level of understanding. You, Moshe, cannot do that, right? But when then God said, I will show you something, but it's not what you're asking. It's going to be a little bit less. That's what God used the nickname, the term, as you can see my back, but you can't see my front. I already explained this in Mishnah Torah and Hilchot Yesodei Torah, which I was going to read it, but I'm going to leave that aside because it'll take us too long. So Amar Khan, therefore it says, what it's saying here is Ki Hashem Yisrael histir mimenu, God hid from him oto hasaga. God hid from him that understanding which Moshe was asking for. Asher kina oso panim, which was being called his face. V'he'evir, and he missed the target. God passed it. In other words, Moshe was asking for this, and God gave him that. God gave him something else. God answered him, you cannot see my essence, but you can see the way I interact with the world. You can see what happens when I interact with the world. You can see my acts of mercy. You can see my acts of kindness. You can see things that I do, how I act with you. Things that we think about them, that there's many different descriptions of how you experience God, but you can't actually see God, right? And Rambam then continues to say, and when I use the term histir mimenu, that God hid from him, what I mean is, the Rambam says, it's like if a person has a certain capacity. Let's say your brain is physically capable of understanding something to a certain level. Certain people have understandings that are higher or better or more or less in certain areas than other people. Certain people just can't get a certain thing. If you've gotten there and then you ask God to heighten the understanding, to make it even better, understand something beyond your capabilities, that's what Moshe was asking for, and that's what God said no to, right? Unless so that this then would be the meaning of the pasuk. Vaya'avor Hashem al ponav, and God passed Moshe away from seeing his face. Vayikra, and then God called out, and etc. We're going to get to the remainder of the pasuk further. So this is a completely different translation of that verse. So now we can look at this verse and we say, we always understand it. God passed by Moshe's face. And then God called out. But that's not what it means anymore, according to Rama. What it means is that God said to Moshe, you can't see my face, right? God said, you're asking for something you can't achieve. But what you can achieve is seeing how I interact with the world. And how is that? And that's what it means in the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah when it says God came to Moshe and appeared in as if he was a leader in synagogue and said, right, this is how you pray to me. This is how you interact with me. And this is what you'll see. You'll see a Kel Racham V'Chanun, a God of mercy, a God of compassion, a God of kindness. This is what you see when you interact with me. This is what you see when you pray with me. And but not because there's an intermediary, not because there's something in between, God says, right? But because you cannot see my face because you're a human being. Now, this is Rambam's explanation. He's actually gonna give in the next paragraph, but we'll have to get to this next time because we're gonna run out of time soon. He's gonna give really 3 or 4 more possible interpretations of those 4 words. And they're all absolutely beautiful and astounding, but I think we'll have to stop now and just sink our teeth into what we just read and try to absorb that and what it means. So I'm going to open the floor to questions or comments, and let's discuss what we just saw, and we'll continue next time with his other explanations of that same verse. So I'm going to open the floor now.
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
I had once read in some commentary that when he says you'll see my back, referring to you'll see me as I act in history, looking back. In other words, I won't give you the future, but I'll give you the past. And when you use the expression just now, you'll see how I interact with the world. Is that close to you'll see me in history, or does that have some different meaning than history?
That, what you just said, is a really beautiful understanding of the verse, and I like it. I don't think, in other words, ufanai, you'll be able to, you can't understand what I'm. It's a different idea. It's a beautiful idea, and I really love it. It's a different one. What's fascinating is one of the last few sentences of the chapter, which we didn't finish today. Rambam says, I just gave you several ways to understand the verse, and whichever one you choose they're all beautiful. They're all good. There's nothing wrong with having a lot of different interpretations. And the one that you just said was a really nice one. But it is different than what the Rambam just said. But
what's the difference between history and interact with the world? That's what I'm trying to see, if it's a different. Is it a shade difference, or is it a whole different category?
I think it's similar in a lot of ways. In other words, but I think that even when we look into the past, we don't understand. We can learn, we could see what happened, but we still don't understand the whys of what God did, why and how, how maybe sometimes, but why we'll still never understand, right? So it's true, we don't know the future and we can't predict what he's going to do in the future, but we also can't understand the past, and we could all think of examples of that. So here what Rambam is saying is that Moshe was being told, right, you can see what I do, and you can interact with me on that level, but to understand my essence and to understand the whys, you'll never understand.
Should we?
Yeah, go ahead.
Should we be looking for a different understanding of my face and my back when we're talking about God? Should we be looking for instead of my face, should it be something else? My front, if you will, and my behind. It's using words that apply to a human body.
Yeah. So we'll see. Rambam says this, that the word face is it refers to a person's essence. It's a kinoi. It doesn't mean it's at God's essence, but when we see a person, we get to know them by looking at their face, right? Mm-hmm. And for better or for worse. We get to know them like at their face. So therefore, because we don't have any other way of describing God's essence versus how we perceive him or how his actions are perceived, so we use the word face by getting to know as a reference, as a way to refer to getting to know God's essence, because that's a similar way that we get to know other people. I can't remember where he says that, but someplace he says that. And if you do find other explanations of panim and achar, like we just had before, other explanations, I'd certainly love to hear them.
Thank you.
Anyone want to contribute anything else or ask or anything? Because the next piece is he's going to discuss a completely different way of reading this verse, and then he's going to do he's going to do in a little bit of a lengthy way, and then he's going to touch on two more quicker ones, and then we'll move on. All right, but one of the things to remember is that almost all of the terms that we've been studying together are found in those verses that we read in Exodus 33 and 34 in Shemot, where we have this encounter between Moshe and God, because it's such a lofty and such a difficult to comprehend encounter. And what we're going to hopefully get to by the time we finish reading this is a little bit of an understanding of what that encounter was all about, and how fundamental it is to Judaism, how fundamental it is to monotheism in general. And so we'll hopefully we'll continue this next week. So if there's no more comments, I'll call it an evening, and thank you so much for sharing, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Yeshua.
Well,
Yeah.
bye.